Hello friends, welcome to .vvm Labs .NET Conf 2020 virtual event. It's my pleasure to be here with you, and of course I'm thrilled by all the announcements we could learn about last week on .NET Conf. There were 3 days of amazing sessions, and of course we have .NET 5, we have C#9, and a lot of news, new tools, new libraries, new versions of frameworks which we can use in our applications. So I hope that you are as thrilled as am I, and that you will enjoy using .NET 5 in your applications from this week. So let me just do a quick recap of all the things that we have heard about on .NET Conf. So let's look what's new. So, of course, the biggest announcement was the release of .NET 5, which is very interesting and it's full of great enhancements, great features, and also supports of new platforms. So from now you can use .NET also on ARM64 and also on WebAssembly, which is very important for people who want to build web applications with Blazor. There was also a release of new language versions. We have C#9 and F#5. So if you are using C#, I am sure that you will love the new features. They are right now they are available in the latest release of Visual Studio. And also there are a lot of new announcements and new features in the libraries and frameworks we already use now. So there is a new version of ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET Core 5. There is a new update for Entity Framework Core, so there is EF Core 5, which brings amazing new features and a lot of improvements. So I'm very happy about all these announcements, and I can't wait to start using them in my applications. So let's look what's new in C#9, because that's what we developers are using every day. So if you want to create a simple program, you don't need to mess with all those namespaces and the main class or things like that. You can just, right now, you can just write your statements in the file, and you don't need to enclose them in the main method in the program class. Yeah, so this is very simple, because right now it's possible to create just one line of C# code and it's fully functional program, because you don't need to create the program class and the static void main method and things like that. There is also a new syntax feature which is called logical and property patterns. And it simplifies a lot of expressions. So, for example, if you have multiple options and you want to use the OR operator, for example, if any of characters from some set are available for this condition, you can just use keychar equals y or n, yeah, and it will expand to key equals y or key equals n. Yeah, so this is much shorter. If you need to eat 3 different characters, this expression will be very, very simple and not long for a full line. Also, there's a property pattern, so you can use the value is and the curly braces, which means that it's some kind of object. It's not null, basically. And also, into these curly braces, you can now write conditions. So the second example is basically equivalent to the obvious method string is null or empty. Yeah, because if it's null, it won't match this object pattern at all. And if it's an object, and of course we expect that this would be string, so if the length is greater than 0, then it means that the string is not empty. So this is basically a replacement for string is null or empty. And there is a lot of usages like this, so I'm sure that you will be able to simplify your conditional expressions in if statements, because right now you don't need to say, okay, this is not null and this property equals something. Yeah, you can simplify this and it should be more clearer to read. Another awesome feature you can find is the record types, which basically simplifies creating those, it's called data transfer object classes. Basically, these are just classes with no logic. They are just containers for data. So there are basically two kinds of declaring a record. First is this one-liner where you can just say public record, name of the class, and then you just list all these parameters in as it would be in a constructor, and they are also exposed as a public init only members. There is also an option to declare record as a normal class, so it would be public record customer and then curly braces. And inside that, you can declare the properties on your own. And there is a new way of declaring properties. You don't need to use getSet, which means that the property can be set at any time. There's a new great support for immutable types, so you can say get init, and it means that the property could be set only from the object initializer. And there is also a nice with keyword that allows you to mutate immutable objects by creating copies. Yeah, so if you have an object with 5 properties and you want to change one of them, you will not mutate the original object, but using the with keyword you will be able to create a copy of this object with one property that is changed in contrast to the original object. So this is very interesting, and I'm really eager to start using this in my projects. There's also the new target framework moniker, so you can use NET 5.0 instead of .NET Core App 3.1. And we don't need .NET Standard anymore, because .NET Standard was basically a bridge to make .NET Framework and .NET Core libraries compatible, so they could target the same API surface, and the internal implementation in those two runtimes was changed. Right now, because also .NET Standard 2.1 was not supported by .NET Framework, it contained features that couldn't be ported in the old runtime. So now every version of .NET Standard would be only for the new .NET. So it means that there's no need for .NET Standard anymore. It did its job quite well because it allowed a lot of library authors, including DotVVM, to target this .NET Standard. But right now, if you want to write new apps or new libraries that take advantage of all those new features, you can just use, for example, .NET 5. And there are also platform-specific versions. So there is also .NET 5.0 -win, which is for Windows, and it gives you more API than just .NET 5.0, but it's just a superset of .NET 5.0. So this is also a new .NET Standard, or something like .NET Standard. You can find a lot of improvements involving performance in the just-in-time compiler and garbage collector. So if you are interested, go search for that. There's a lot of low-level stuff happening in these two main components. But it's very interesting to see how the people in .NET team are trying hard to make the performance even better. There's also a new thing, not entirely new, but still it's went through some evolution, and you can publish single file applications from .NET 5, so you don't end up with a folder of hundreds of files and all those libraries. You will be able to produce just a deployment with just a few files, in ideal case with just one file. So this is also interesting, because when you, for example, want to deploy a web application, and if it means that you need to copy 100 files somewhere, then it may be broken during the upload. So half of the files is already deployed and the second half is not there. It could break you quite significantly. So that's why the single file applications are so important, because if the transfer of the file is interrupted in the middle, then the old version is could still be there. Yeah, it's easier to replace one file than hundreds of files consistently. There is a lot of new improvements in system text JSON. So if you have been using this new JSON parser, you can get even better performance, and it's for free. You don't need to change anything in your code. Actually, we have tried in our company, we have tried to migrate several projects to .NET 5, and we didn't find any breaking changes. We were going through from 3.1 to 5, and there were basically no breaking changes that would affect us. So this is also very great. If you have been using WinForms on .NET Core, which is also a very interesting option that was made available from .NET Core 3.0, you probably found that the WinForms designer in Visual Studio didn't support all those things. The reasons for that are a lot of some technical internal details, because the WinForms designer depends on the .NET Framework version that Visual Studio is built and executed in. Yeah, so if you want to use WinForms but you want to model some controls that are from .NET Core, these are a little different from the framework ones. Not significantly, but still it's not good for the designer experience. So what the team had to do is to extract the WinForms designer to other process which can load the particular version of .NET Core runtime your application is targeting, so the designer will behave exactly the same as the real controls from that particular version of the .NET Core. And of course it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort to make this working. So now in the last release of Visual Studio, this designer should have all features and there shouldn't be any problems. So until now it was in preview, now it should be out of preview. And another very popular thing for developers who are building mostly the desktop apps is the Click Once deployment. It's that technology that was very popular back in these years of .NET Framework. And you basically clicked the project and said publish and selected where the package should be uploaded, and it supported automatic updates of the desktop apps and so on. So it was pretty convenient for simple scenarios, and now Click Once supports .NET Core, including the self-contained deployment, so you can deploy the runtime alongside with your application. It's very easy to configure, and also I believe that it should be much easier to involve in continuous integration and continuous delivery scenarios. So that's the short recap of .NET Conf. And because this local event is organized by .VVM team, of course I will share also news concerning .NET 5 from our project, from our open source project. So for those of you who haven't heard about .VVM yet, it's an open source framework. It's a member of .NET Foundation, and the framework basically allows you to build web applications with just C# and HTML, so you don't need to learn advanced JavaScript techniques. And the framework is using model view view model approach. So if you have been building desktop apps in WPF or mobile apps in Xamarin, I'm sure that .VVM will be interesting for you, because you can use the same MVVM approach to build applications on the web. And if you look closer, you will see that the MVVM in .VVM is even easier than it was in WPF or Xamarin, because you, for example, don't need to implement iNotify property changed, and the binding system is, I think, much more powerful than that. What is interesting on .VVM, it supports not only new .NET Core and .NET 5, it also supports .NET Framework. So it can be used as a, let's say, conversion bridge for all .NET Framework applications that allows to modernize them continuously and upgrade them to .NET 5. So for example, if you have some old legacy ASP.NET Web Form application, and want to go to .NET 5 with this application, it means that you will need to get rid of parts of the application that depends on .NET Framework libraries, which is basically the web forms, because System Web wasn't ported to .NET 5 and it never will be ported to this new runtime. So you need to, you can keep a lot of the code, but you need to replace the web forms with some other presentation technology. And if you decide to rewrite your application in something completely different, for example, Angular, React, or even Blazor, it means that these technologies will probably need a new runtime from the beginning. At least for Blazor, you cannot run Blazor in .NET Framework. So you need to start a new application alongside with the old one, and you will probably need to run both of them at the same time and do some kind of single sign-on or things like that. With .VVM, you don't have to have two applications. You can modernize in place in the old project, because .VVM supports both .NET Framework and .NET Core. It can hook up to old request pipeline and to the new ASP.NET Core request pipeline. So this is why I'm so thrilled about the .VVM way of modernizing web apps. So let's look about at .VVM. For those who are new, I will just shortly share what is .VVM and how the model view model experience work, but it will take just a few minutes, and after that I will show the modernization scenario. And then after a short break, I have a lot of news from the .VVM team, what we are planning in the next versions of .VVM, and what's the future roadmap for .VVM. So stay tuned, and right now I will show the basics of .VVM, so even people who haven't heard about it yet will get an idea how the framework works and how simple it is to build web applications using .VVM. So let's start. So .VVM, as I said, is an open source framework that lets you build web apps for ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core. So no matter which version of ASP.NET you are using, you can use .VVM. The framework is member of the .NET Foundation, which is great because we get a lot of support, and we were also presenting some things about .VVM on .NET Conf, which is thanks to our membership in the .NET Foundation. So I'm very grateful for what the foundation is doing. .VVM is not only the framework, not only some NuGet package that you install in the project, it also has an extension for Visual Studio, because .VVM is using its own version of markup files. So in order to provide syntax highlighting and IntelliSense and all those things, you need to install an extension for Visual Studio. But good news, it's free, because we are an open source project. There is also a commercial version which has more features than the free version, but you can use the free version even for large projects. It just, you don't have all the features, you have only half of the features. But still, it's very useful, and the IntelliSense and syntax highlighting is there. So .VVM can be used for building new web apps, and as I mentioned, you don't need to learn and write JavaScript. You can go just with HTML and C#, because the view models are just C# classes, nothing really special. You are using just normal C# files. And the views, which is basically what the user can see, it's HTML with few syntax flavors. There are components, there are data binding expressions, because without data binding there is no MVVM. And .VVM ships also with plenty of built-in components like grid view and repeater. So if you have been using web forms, for example, or any other ASP.NET based framework, you will find similar controls there. So if you want, for example, to use .VVM for migration of old web forms applications and you were using grid views, you will find grid view also in .VVM, and it will have the similar feature set. Yeah. So you are just using components, data bindings, and you are binding to a C# view model, and all the business logic and data access and everything is done in C#. You don't need JavaScript, but if you know JavaScript, it's a great advantage because you will be able to do much more in .VVM. .VVM doesn't have an ambition to completely protect you from the JavaScript world. I think that because we are on the web, we need to interact with other things that the web naturally brings. So I think that .vvm should just go out of the way if you want to interact with anything JavaScript. So if you know JavaScript, it will be great because you can do more. But if you are just learning it, or if you don't have experience with that, no problem, you can start using .vvm today without learning too much. .vvm integrates seamlessly in the ASP.NET ecosystem. So if you are using other frameworks, other technologies like SignalR or things like that, or you want to create a REST API that should be an integral part of your application, it's not a problem. .vvm is just a middleware that you will plug into ASP.NET request pipeline, and it can coexist with other technologies, other solutions. So it fits in the ecosystem, and if you want to use, for example, some special authentication middleware, there will be no differences because .vvm just relies on the ASP.NET infrastructure. If you want to start with .vvm, you can go to dotvvm.com/install, and you will find a very easy way to install the extension. Basically, you can open the extensions menu in Visual Studio and search for .vvm, and that's it. Then you just click install, and when you install the extension, you can do just file new project, and you will have project templates for creating a new application for .NET Core and also for .NET Framework, because if you want to try .vvm on .NET Framework, you can start a new project on .NET Framework. For production, I wouldn't recommend this too much, but you can. Nobody is preventing you from doing so. Okay, so let's look at the demo. I have created a simple application, and I will just show if you want to install .vvm for Visual Studio, you can go to the extensions menu and manage extensions, and you can just look for .vvm. So if you type .vvm in the search box, you should be able to find this extension. We support Visual Studio 2017 and 2019. Make sure you are running on the latest updates, because the extension, the newest version of the extension always supports the newest version of Visual Studio. So be sure to install the latest updates to Visual Studio to have the best experience. Okay, so I have the extension already installed, so there is no install button for me, but you should be able to see it here. When you install the extension, you can do File, New Project, and you can search for .vvm, and you will see several project templates. There is .NET Core template, and there is OWIN and .NET Framework. So based on the framework you want to use, you can choose the template, and if you do so, there is a simple wizard which will help you to configure the project. I have already created the project, so I won't spend a lot of time by creating it, but that's what you will see when you create the project. So there is several things. If I open the project file, you can see that I'm targeting .NET 5. Yeah, so this is running on the latest version of .vvm, which is 2.5, and it's running on .NET 5. And .vvm is just one NuGet package, so this package gets installed automatically in your project, and that's all you need to work with .vvm. And if you look to Program CS and compare it with any other ASP.NET Core application, it looks the same. This is just normal ASP.NET Core application. You will deploy .vvm applications the same way as you deploy MVC or Blazor or any other ASP.NET Core applications. There are no changes here. It's just a NuGet package. In the startup class, it's getting a little bit more interesting. There is a few lines of code that's generated for you. First is in the configure services, we are adding .vvm services. And here in the request pipeline, we are adding the .vvm middleware in the pipeline. And if you want to use SignalR together with .vvm, you can just say app.use SignalR or use MVC or use any other framework. So you can combine these technologies. And there is another file which is called .vvm startup, and it contains .vvm specific configuration. So there is a configuration of routes. You can register routes for your individual pages. You can configure your user controls, and you can configure resources. I have a few lines that configure, that basically tells .vvm where, on which path it can find Bootstrap, in which path it can find CSS styles for my page and things like that. And the last and most important things are these two folders, the views and view models. These folders contain the .vvm markup files. So this is the .html file. As you can see, it's basically it's HTML, but we have some special syntax flavors like this. This is a .vvm component. You can see this dot prefix here. And there are also a directive. So this tells .vvm which class is the view model for this page. So if I open the default view model, you can see it's just a plain C# class that inherits from some other view model. I'm using master pages in this project. If you were using ASP.NET Web Forms, you probably know what's master page. It's basically a layout template for your website. So you can put your common elements of the website, for example, the header and menu and footer in the master page. Yeah, so it will look like this. I don't have any header, any footer. And then you will use the content placeholder control, which basically says, on this place, I want to have the content of the specific page. And this default HTML page just says, okay, put this content into the master page. So the header and the footer will be composed together. It's similar if you are using MVC, it's a similar thing as the render body or things like that. So this is the template, how the entire website will look like. And this is a placeholder for the content of the specific page. Okay, so I have a few lines of HTML here. That's what my designer gave to me because my aesthetical skills are not very great. I really shouldn't do a design of user interface. But as you can see, it's using Bootstrap 4, so it's very simple. And it's a simple task list application. So here is a list of tasks, and I can add new tasks, and I can mark some tasks as completed. So that's a very simple thing to do, and it's a static page. It doesn't do anything. If you click on all those things, it doesn't actually do anything because it's pure HTML. However, I will put it some life into this HTML using .vvm. So if you look closer to the page, and if you look in how model view model approach works, basically you need to figure out what's the state of the page. Yeah? Because the purpose of the view model is to maintain the state of the page and handle interactions from the user. So for example, as a user, when I click this button, the view model should decide what will happen. And typically the view model will change its state. For example, if I enter some tasks here and click on the button, the state of the view model is changed, so the task will appear here in this list. So in my view model, I will probably need some string property to persist the new task text, new task title, or it doesn't matter how the name will look like, but I need to store the value which is in this text box. Then I will need a function that will be called when I click this button. And I will probably need some collection of tasks because I don't know how many of them will be on this place. So let's create this structure in the view model. So in .vvm, all state should be represented as public properties. So first one will be the new task. And it's just a string property because whatever the user types in the text box will be stored in this property. And vice versa, the data binding is always two-way. So if anyone changes this property, it will be reflected in the text box. Yeah, the new value will appear there. So this is the new task. And then I will need a collection of tasks. And I already have a class for that. I have a class which is called task model. And I will prepare a collection of tasks, and just to be sure it's not null, I will just initialize it. And if you look in the task model, you can see there are three properties. Every task has its unique ID, so I'm using GUID for this purpose. There is a text, and there is a is completed flag, which means that the task has already been finished. Okay, and I can try the new C# feature, which should be like this. If you just type new and parentheses, it should use this type and initialize the collection. So it seems that I am not getting any build errors. So my last version of Visual Studio already supports C#9. So that's pretty awesome. I've saved some keystrokes. Okay, so now we should implement the functions of the page. The first will be add task. So if somebody clicks the add task button, I have to create a new task and put it in the collection. So let's say tasks, add new task model, and I should say ID equals, and I will generate a new unique ID, so new GUID, and the text of the task equals new task. And what's also typical for these applications, I should reset the text box so it will be empty, so I can add a second task. So I can also say new task equals string empty. Yeah. And that's awesome because the data binding is two-way. So if the user changes the text box, I will see this value in the view model. And if the view model decides to change the value, it will be synchronized with the text box. So the text box will basically clear out. Okay. So this is how I am adding a new task, but it's not completed because I will need some other functions. But let's just try this. So this is a start of my view model, and I have this short form here. It's inline form in Bootstrap, and I have a text box and a button here. But in order to use data binding, I need to convert this to real .vvm components. So we have a text box component in .vvm, and if you open up this yellow bulb, there is an option that allows you to convert pure HTML elements to .vvm components. So I can turn this to text box. You can see it changed the syntax. And the CSS class remained, the placeholder remained, but I need to bind the text box to some value in the view model. So that would be the new task. Okay? So this is my text box, and now it's synchronized with the new task property in the view model. So now I have the button. So let's convert this to the button, and we need to tell .vvm what should happen with when I click the button. So let's say click equals, and now we will be calling a command in the view model, and it's called add task. Yeah. So that's how you are using data binding. If you want to bind property values, you are using value. If you want to call methods, you can use command. And there is a next thing. Here, this is a list of all the tasks, but it's not dynamic. It doesn't change when I add or remove new tasks. So let's convert this. Basically, I will render a collection here. So let's change this to a control, which is called repeater. And what repeater does is that you will set a data source to some kind of collection. So it can be just a generic list as the tasks. Yeah, the task is system collections generic list. And it will repeat its contents for every item in this collection. So here I have an example of a task which is not completed. So I need to print out the text of the task. Yeah, so this will be just the text in the task. And this icon should be a button. And because it's styled as a link, I will use a control which is called link button, which is basically a hyperlink that will behave like a button. And when I click on it, I need to call a function. There is one glitch here. I need to call a function, but the function won't be in the task model class. Task model is just a container for data. It has only properties, but not functions. So I need to have some kind of complete method in my page view model. So I can say parent, underscore parent, and it will go one scope up. So inside the repeater, I'm binding to properties of the individual tasks. If I say parent, I will go up. So it will look for the function in the same scope as, for example, this at task, yeah, in the scope of the entire view model. So I can say complete task. And I need to pass, because I have a lot of tasks, I need to pass the ID of the task, which I want to mark as completed. So that's it. And the method doesn't exist in the view model. I haven't created it yet. So I can just have it created using this, yellow bulb. Yeah. So it will create the method for me. And let's look what's the difference if the task is already completed. If it's completed, then this span has the class equals completed. So I can use expressions in my bindings. So I can say class equals, if it's completed, then the class will be completed. Otherwise, it will be just an empty string. But I really don't like this syntax. This is awful, and it can be a little bit simpler. So I can use this. This is a nice feature of .vvm. You can say class dash completed equals, and here you can say just a Boolean expression. And if the expression is true, then this class will be added to the class attribute. Yeah, so you can combine multiple classes, and you can just specify Boolean expression for all of these classes, and .vvm will evaluate these expressions, and those who will be evaluated to true, those classes will be combined together. So you don't need to write crazy expressions like this, because if there is another property, for example, is past due date, this expression would get more complicated, because I would need to combine all those options that may occur at the same time. So let's get rid of this, and let's use this. So the class will be here, and the button shouldn't be there if the task is already completed, because you don't need the button to complete a task when it's already completed. So we can use visible, and you can use visible on every element in .vvm, including plain HTML elements. So I can say value, and I need to have expression here. So if it's not completed, then this button will be visible. Otherwise, visible will be false, so this won't appear in the table. So, and I can remove the second example, and that's it. That's my page. So let's start. And if I refresh the page, it takes some time because the page needs to recompile. You can see the collection is empty, so I have no tasks right now. And if I add some task and click on add tasks, here is my task. So this is a second task, and this is the third task. And if you click on complete, then not implemented exception, because I haven't created the logic yet. This is a .vvm error page, so you can find more information about the correct cause of this exception. So let's implement this, and I can just say tasks single t id equals id. So I will look for that particular task with the ID I got in my method, and say is completed equals true. And right now, when I refresh the page, the tasks were stored only in memory, so now they will disappear. That's not what I would need. I would need to store them in the database, but this is just a simple example. And now you can see the class is applied, so this is there is strike through, and the button disappeared. So that's how you can interact in .vvm. And of course, this is not storing data anywhere. And that's the problem, because if you restart the application, this is just in memory, so this will disappear. What we can do is use dependency injection to provide some functionality. Yeah. And in every view model in .vvm, you can just request your business logic classes. So for example, I have created a class which is called task service. And you can just generate field for it, I recommend to use fields, not properties, for these services, because .vvm needs to serialize the view model in JSON and send it to the browser. And if it's just a field, it won't get serialized. So if the service has any state, you don't probably want this in the view model. So only use properties for the state of the view model. Okay, so this is how you can get a service, and this service can implement your database storage logic. I strongly recommend not to just pass DB context in the view model and just loading and saving data in the view model. You want to separate the business logic away from the view models. View models are part of the presentation layer, so they probably shouldn't contain much business logic. They should only delegate all those things to the services. So this my service is pretty nice. If I want to add new task, I can just say task service add task, and I will pass the new task here. So that's it. Yeah. So I will just pass the new task to my service, and when I want to complete task, I can also say task service complete task and say ID, and that's it. The last thing, there will probably be some loading, because on the first request this collection will be empty, so I need to load the tasks from the database. Yeah, so let's do it. In every view model you can override several methods, and if you have been using ASP.NET Web Forms, you will probably recognize the init load pre-render pattern. If you want to load data, the best place for this is pre-render. So let's override the pre-render function, and it's here because the view model inherits from .vvm view model base class. This method pre-render is in the base class of all view models, and here I can say tasks equals task service get tasks, and that's it. This will load my tasks from the database and put them in the tasks selection. So it's very nice, because now you have a service which does all the business logic and doesn't depend on user interface. Yeah, it doesn't know about which page is using this service. It doesn't need to know it. It's some kind of business logic. So you shouldn't combine this in the view model. The view model should just delegate all the calls to the business logic services. Okay, so let's try this. I will rebuild the application and start it. You can see that the first request always takes a little bit longer, because .vvm and all those libraries are loading up and starting. So you can see it loaded my tasks from the database. I can complete some task and I can add new task. So for example, .vvm is awesome. Yeah? So that's it. So that's how you would be using .vvm and how the MVVM experience looks like. So basically you need to maintain the state of the page. So anything that can be changed in the page has to be reflected using public properties in the view model. And all functions that the user can invoke from the page using buttons or links or any other way needs to be exposed as public methods in the view model. And you can use dependency injection, so you can just grab all the data from the view model that are needed to perform the operation and call some method in your service. That's the correct pattern that should be used. Not only in .vvm, it applies also to MVC and controllers. You shouldn't work with DB context directly in the controllers, because controllers are same as view model, part of the presentation layer, not part of the business layer. Yeah? It will make your application better testable, better maintainable, and if any of these technologies will just die, yeah, and we saw Silverlight dying, we saw ASP.NET Web Forms dying, if your business logic it's not spawned in the presentation layer, it's much simpler to replace this presentation technology with some other. Yeah? So that's just a recommendation how you can approach this. So that's how MVVM experience looks like. And as I mentioned, you don't need to know JavaScript. You saw that the page was pretty interactive. There were no hard refreshes of the page. the page, it's basically a single page application, but still all the communication was done using some REST requests with JSON, and it was done using Ajax. So no hard refreshes, like for example in Razor Pages. But you didn't need to, I didn't write a single line of JavaScript. All I was using was C# and HTML. So if your application is, for example, some line of business application, some admin dashboard or anything with grids or large forms or something like that, MVVM can be a great pattern for these experiences. So I encourage everyone to try .vvm, and you will see if you like this approach. And I didn't have to implement iNotify property change or anything like that, yeah, because thanks to the nature of .vvm, it's not necessary. The only requirement is that the view model has to be serializable in JSON, because .vvm needs to deliver it to the client. Also, you don't need to build any kind of APIs. Yeah, I didn't have to build some kind of REST API, so I would be able to get my data on the client side. The data was part of the view model, and the view model will be delivered to the client naturally. Of course, if you don't want to learn JavaScript and you want to stick with C# and HTML, you can also use Blazor, and it's Microsoft's preferred way of doing things. There are several. Blazor is a great technology, and there is a lot of use cases for that. The only cases where I'm worried about is if the users don't have a good network. Because if there are two versions of Blazor, basically, if you are using the WebAssembly version, it means that it needs to download quite a lot of libraries to the client. And even if they are already loaded in some kind of cache, they will need to be started. So if you have some slow or cheap mobile phone, still it may take some time until all those libraries are loaded and the runtime is initialized. There is some burden that it's there. Of course, it's very powerful. You have the full features of the C#, but in some cases, it's not the ideal scenario. For these cases, maybe Blazor server will work, but because it basically renders everything on the server and uses SignalR connection to deliver these changes to the client. But if the network is not stable, then you will see some interruptions, because the application on the client is basically, it doesn't contain any logic. It just takes all events that happen and send them to the server, and the server needs to tell the application what should happen when you click on the button. So this also can be problematic in some scenarios. And also, if your clients still need to use, for example, Internet Explorer 11, or if you for some reason need to stick with all .NET Framework, then Blazor is not a choice, because it doesn't work on .NET Framework. Yeah, .vvm doesn't use WebAssembly and it doesn't use SignalR. The only thing that .vvm adds in your application is something like 100 kilobytes of JavaScript before compression. So if you even compress this, it's very small. Yeah? Of course, the C# experience on the client is not, the C# is not being used on the client. The data bindings are translated in JavaScript, but the logic in the view model is happening on the server. So of course, Blazor WebAssembly is more powerful. If you want to do things on the client, you will be able to do it with Blazor WebAssembly. But in many cases, you don't need to care if your C# is running on the client or on the server. You just want your job to be done. So give .vvm a try, and you will see if this approach is good for you. I still think that .vvm is very helpful, especially thanks to the model view model experience, which is great for a lot of especially business applications. And as I said, .vvm cannot be used only for can be used not only for building new web apps, but also for modernizing legacy applications. And you will see this feature in a minute. if you install the latest version of .vvm extension, it brings also a lot of new improvements. We have spent a lot of effort on the performance, so it works fast even on long files with thousands of lines of code. Unfortunately, some people are producing such pages, but that's life. And we have also added several new features. For example, if you have a collection in the view model and you want to use grid view, you can just say dot grid view data source equals that collection. And if you click on the yellow bulb, it will allow you to auto-generate the columns from the model you are using in your view model. So that's a nice feature. And the newest enhancement is the add.vvm feature. And it's great if you have legacy web forms applications, because it installs and configures .vvm in the project for you, so you can start modernizing your app. How the modernization works? If you have a web forms application, it looks like this. If you get an HTTP request, it gets processed by ASP.NET Web Forms pipeline. There will be probably some kind of ancient authentication, like forms authentication, for example. You shouldn't use it in new apps today because there are more secure mechanisms to do authentication. And then there is some kind of routing or something like that. So the request gets to the specific page and it gets processed and the response is returned back. If you want to modernize this application, and if it's large, if it has hundreds of pages, it's not easy, because you would need to replace all those pages with something else before you can go to .NET Core or .NET 5. With .vvm, you can do it in place. So you can just take one page after another and replace them, but those two technologies can coexist in the same app. So you can plan this migration process for a couple of weeks or maybe months, and you are still running the same application. You have the same data access, you have the same business logic, so you can just start replacing pages, and after a few months, you will get rid of all web forms artifacts, and then you will be able to go to .NET Core. So if you install .vvm.owin and Microsoft Owin host system web packages in your application and do some necessary configuration, basically what will happen is that this second package will add this Owin request pipeline in front of ASP.NET Web Forms pipeline. So all requests will go to the Owin pipeline first, and if .vvm, which will be hooked in this pipeline, if .vvm can process these requests, they will be dispatched to the specific dot HTML page. And if there is no .vvm page that could handle the request, they will be passed to the ASP.NET Web Forms pipeline. So Web Forms will work as a fallback, basically. Yeah? But you are still in the same application. You can use the same authentication. So it's just one app. So if the user signs in the Web Forms part, even the .vvm part will see that the user is signed in and will be able to interact with the same business logic, with the same services, with the same database. You don't need to change your business logic mostly or at all. And over time, after a few months, maybe weeks, it depends on the size of the application, you will be able to replace all ASPX files in the application. And that's the point where you can start planning the migration for .NET 5, because it just needs to replace few NuGet packages. Yeah? So you will, at the last step, you will remove the NuGet packages and you will install .vvm.asp.NET Core. And the syntax of the pages and view models is exactly the same. There are no changes, so this is compatible. And you will just to figure out the remaining things that are dependent on .NET Framework. For example, the forms authentication will be probably replaced by ASP.NET Core way of authentication. And of course, if you are using Entity Framework or some other data access technology, then you need to migrate it to .NET Core 3 or .NET 5. But if you can upgrade to Entity Framework 6.3 at last, then this works on .NET Core 2. So there is a high chance that Web Forms is the only thing preventing you from going to .NET Core or .NET 5. If you have Entity Framework 6, then it should be easy because it's supported also on .NET Core and .NET 5. Yeah? And of course, we are now running on .NET Core, and of course, you need to replace all the pages, but there are not only pages in the project. Typically, there are hundreds or thousands of C# files with the business logic and all those services and data access and things like that, and these can remain as they are. Yeah, so you don't need to start a second application, which is also a challenge, because if you have two applications, you need to deal with single sign-on. You need to sign the user to one app and to the second one, and both are running on different runtimes, both have different format of the authentication cookie, so you cannot use the same cookie for two applications because form authentication cookie looks differently than ASP.NET Core. You will probably need to share some common data because the applications may talk to the same database, but that could mean some conflict. So you need to figure out these ways. There may be caches that can get out of sync, so you need to invalidate a cache in both applications. For example, that's not very straightforward. So this way of modernizing allows you to be with one application, and you can fix the issues in the old pages, at the same time add new pages in .vvm, and at the same time you can rewrite all those pages one by one from the old technology to the new technology. So you can spend this process for a couple of months or weeks or months, and that's how you can do the migration. And the application is still work, it can still be compiled, you can deploy it to the server at any time, so you don't need to tell your customers, okay, don't ask us for new features for 2 years because we are doing a rewrite. No, you will be able to incorporate the new requirements from the users during the modernization process, which is great. So let's look at the demo. I have a very popular project running here. It's a blockengine.net. I guess that some of you are maybe powering your own blog site using blockengine.net. It's a very popular .NET solution for blogging sites. So you can see all those ASPX pages here, and I can run it. So you will see that it works, and it takes a couple of seconds until it loads up because there is some database initialization and all those things. But .vvm is not in this project. It's not installed in this project, so this is not .vvm's fault that it takes 10 or 15 seconds to start up. So let's wait. Okay, this is what you will see when you download the clean version of blockengine.net. And it's a web forms project. So if you install the latest version of .vvm for Visual Studio, and right click on the project, you will see a new feature called add.vvm, and it will install everything you need to start using .vvm in this project. So it will do it for you. So if you click on it, you will see that a list of things that we will do to your project, and it takes a minute, so I will just explain what it involves. Basically, it needs to install those two NuGet packages. So it installs .vvm.owin, and it installs Microsoft owin host system web. And as you probably know, on .NET Framework, installing any NuGet package takes a couple of seconds, so that's why we are still waiting. Not only the NuGet packages, there is other things that needs to be done. It needs to add the startup file, which is a configuration for the owin pipeline, because you need to tell owin, okay, if the request comes in, use .vvm middleware to process the request, and if .vvm cannot process the request, then there will be fallback to ASP.NET Web Forms. So that's it. And there is also the views, view models folders, which we already saw, and the .vvm startup, which is the configuration of .vvm stuff. Yeah, so now we are done, and you can see there are in the references there are .vvm framework, .vvm framework owin, .vvm core. So it added few references, and it also created the startup file, and this is the marked with the owin startup attribute, and I'm just calling use.vvm, so it plugs the .vvm middleware in the pipeline. And if .vvm won't handle the request will go to ASP.NET Web Forms. So let's do this. if I just recompile the application and run it, you would see that it would work normally. I won't do it because it would take another 30 seconds. What I can do is to add a .vvm page in the project. So let's do add new item, and let's add .vvm page. So I will name it, for example, test. And .vvm is asking if I want to create a view model also. So let's create a view model too. So you will see it here in the view models. Okay. And that's my page. So let's say, for example, hello, oh, sorry, h1, hello from .vvm. Okay. So let's now we can run it. So now also the block engine will be starting, so it will take some time, but hopefully we will be able to see the home page, yeah, because .vvm shouldn't break anything. Yeah, the home page is not registered for .vvm, so it should pass the request down to the web forms pipeline. Okay, so just a few seconds. Okay, in the meantime, I can look in the chat if there are any questions. It looks like... Yeah, so there is a question if .vvm is using Razor syntax. No, we have our own syntax because in Razor it was difficult to support two-way data bindings and things like that. So we have our own view engine, and that's one of the reasons you need the Visual Studio extension, because we are doing IntelliSense for these DOT HTML files. Yeah, so we are not using Razor, but the syntax is a little similar, and Razor added the tag helpers. So .vvm was started in 2014, where there weren't tag helpers. You were using the HTML.something API to render everything, but later they added tag helpers. So that was also a concern, but we wouldn't be able to simply add our own components in Razor. So that's why we have our own engine. There is another question: can you add new routes dynamically at runtime? There is also an answer, so thank you for it. Basically, you cannot. You need to configure .vvm at the beginning, and then the configuration is basically immutable. It's new from .vvm 2.4. Previously, it was possible to mutate the configuration after the application startup, and it was a bad thing because basically it wasn't possible. It could break so many things that we decided to just make this illegal. So if you try to modify the configuration after the application starts, you will get an exception. If you want to add pages dynamically while the application is running, it's possible, but you would need to implement some few interfaces from the .vvm runtime. So there is a thing which is called custom presenter, and using the custom presenter, you would be able to dispatch requests at the runtime. Okay, so now the block engine is running, and if you go to /test, that's now .vvm page should be activated, so you can see .vvm is running inside our application. That's still one process. It shares the resources. You can access any class from web forms and from .vvm, and I'm using this is just pure HTML, so it doesn't look nice, but if you use the same CSS as on the main site, you would be able to create an experience for the users that they couldn't distinguish whether it's written in web forms or in .vvm. So this is nice. And I've just added the page called test, and it was mapped automatically because I have this auto discover routes here. So basically it will look in the views folder And for all pages it finds there, it will register routes. If you want to have parameters in the routes, you need to add your route configuration here. So you can register this page with these parameters and things like that. So that's how this works. And of course, if I just register some route to, for example, the URL /contact or /archive or anything, I can just replace the web form page with .vvm. So now the process will look like this. You will take this page and you will need to do two things. The first is to convert this ASPX syntax to .vvm syntax. It's different, but a lot of controls in .vvm are named the same as in web forms, so this makes the migration a little bit easier. And the biggest problem is the code behind, because web forms applications tend to have a lot of code in the code behind files, and often you can find a business logic there. For example, in this block engine, for example, there is a function called send mail. I think that it shouldn't be in the code behind, so this is also a great opportunity to refactor this function away from your presentation layer. So create something like emailing service or mail sender or anything like that, and move this logic to a business layer where it should belong. And then you can just call this method from your view model. So this will help you to refactor these code behind files. The biggest issue is that in a web forms you typically need to access the components in the page. So there is text box ID equals txt subject, and you are just touching its text property. So in case of .vvm, you will probably have a public property called subject, and you will set the subject, not the txt subject.text. So these kind of refactorings you will have to do. The good thing on it is that it will make your view models and your pages testable, because view model, it doesn't depend on the page, on the browser, on anything. It just works with its state, it changes its state and interacts with business layer services. So you can write tests that make sure that if you create a view model, set some properties and do something, you can simulate the click on the button by just calling the add task method, for example, then you can make sure that the thing that should happen actually happened, and you don't need to run the browser, you don't need to use Selenium for the UI testing and things like that. Okay, so that's the refactoring you will need to do, and we have a tool that can help you with this. If you go to dotvvm.com/webforms, there are two things. The first is the cheat sheet, which describes the changes between ASPX and web forms syntax. So, for example, we don't need the form element, which should wrap the entire page. We don't need run server. We don't need the controls to have their IDs, because we are using data binding. We are not interacting with the controls in the view normally. .vvm doesn't have view state. Instead, it serializes the view model and sends it to the client. So you have control over the state of the page, because what's in the view model, that's your state. Yeah, so you are the one who decides what will be part of your state and what you won't have in the view model, and will just load from the database. And so there is a lot of differences. You can see, for example, you can use the data binding expressions everywhere, not only in data bound controls, you don't need to call data bind explicitly. And so that's the cheat sheet, which describes all the changes. And we have also a tool which is called ASPX converter. And if I take this markup from ASPX page, and if I copy and paste it here, you will see that we have this tool will analyze this markup and give you some tips what you should change. So for example, in .vvm we are not using run server. It's not needed. It's just a useless attribute in .vvm. So I can click on apply all fixes, and it will remove run server everywhere. Yeah, all 18 occurrences of this will get removed. Also, there is, for example, the text box control. So if I expand these 4 occurrences and click on show, it will highlight the text box in web forms. So this is the text box. And in .vvm, it's not called ASP text box, it's called DOT text box. So I can just apply the fix, and it changes the text box to DOT text box, which is compatible with .vvm. And it also creates a data binding expression for me, because without it, you won't be able to interact with the text box from the view model. So it will generate this expression for you. And also there is step 3, which also prepares things that you will need in your view model. So this is what you can take and paste into your view model, because for 100% you will need it, because otherwise you won't be able to read anything the user has inserted in the text box. Yeah, so this is a tool which doesn't, of course, it doesn't cover 100% of the transformations you will need, but still it will help you with the most frequent cases and most frequent things. So you can just apply all these things on the view model, and then you can paste it to the DOT HTML page, and the extension should also underscore the remaining problems in the markup. So you will need to deal with them on your own, but still it's better than nothing. And we are still expanding this tool, so if you find anything that this tool could do automatically, just let us know. We will be happy to add any other analyzers here that would help you to do the transformations you will need. Yeah, there is another example for this. There is a button on the end of the page, so it's ASP button, and I can also apply a fix, so it will change it to DOT button, and it will also create a command binding. Yeah, so there is a method that you can just implement, and you have it in your view model. So that's pretty nice, and I have been using this tool for a while, and it helps me at least with the most repeated, most frequent transforms that I need to do in my code. Of course, that's still quite a lot of work, but the most important thing for me is that probably your large web forms application will have thousands of classes with business logic and things like that. And if you would like to use any other technology, you will probably need to build some kind of API around this business logic. But if you are using it from .vvm, you can access the database directly. You can work with the database the same way as you were in web forms, because you are still on the same server and you don't need to change the runtime. You can be on the .NET framework until you are completely ready to do the switch. Yeah, so that's, for me, this is the greatest advantage. So let's wrap up. And there is a question in the chat. I replace all web forms pages with .vvm pages. My project is ready to be upgraded to .NET 5. What happens with all under the hood web forms files that makes web forms possible? I'm not sure what is meant by under the hoods web forms files. If you mean the code behind, you need to refactor this to the view model. So for example, here you will have contact DOT HTML, so you will convert the markup to .vvm syntax, and there will be contact view model. So in that you need a string property for every text box. Yeah, so that's, and there is also a load method, so you can just read the query string and put it in these properties. Then there is the button which will validate the CAPTCHA and perform the validation and send the email. Yeah, so that's what you will need to refactor. And in most cases, you can just copy this method in the view model, and there will of course be some syntax problems. So we don't have page is valid. The validation is done automatically in .vvm. If you don't want it, you have to explicitly turn it off. So you don't need to check for page is valid, because if it's not valid, your method won't be even invoked. Yeah, so these are some differences, but still you will do the same thing. And basically you will just grab the data from the view model and call the business logic method. So this send mail would be there, and you can just call it. So you have to get rid of ASPX files and the code behind files. These will get refactored to view models. And then if there are some controls like the ASCX user controls, this has to be also rewritten to DOT control, which is also DOT HTML, but it has different extension for user controls. But .vvm also has user controls. So that's it. But there is also the block engine.core, which contains all the business logic, and you don't need to touch this project and you can use it the same way. Yeah, so that's the greatest benefit, because you can do it basically in place. You don't need to start over with the second project. And the last thing I would like to show is the authentication. We have I'm not sure what's happening to the IntelliSense right now. Yeah, it's working. Yeah, so we have for example, we have a component called authenticated view, and it can display different content to users who are signed up and the users who are anonymous. So for example, I can do hello anonymous, and I can do hello signed user. Yeah, in the authenticated template, this is what the signed in users will see, and this is what the anonymous users will see. So that's it. And if I go back to my application, hopefully it will load faster than the last time. And if you, I will sign in, and you will see that .vvm will be able to get this this identity of the user the same way as in web forms. Yeah, so okay, it looks like the application. Okay, now we are started. So if I go to /test, you will see that hello anonymous, which means that I'm not signed in. And if I go to the login page and try to sign in, so admin, and now I should be signed in. So if I go to the test page, then you can see there is hello signed user. Yeah. So no matter if you sign the user in the .vvm part or in the web forms part, you are running in the same application, you are using the same authentication cookie, and the user identity is shared. Yeah. So also, and most business applications in web forms are using some kind of sign-in. So the great thing is that you are running in the same app and you have this available out of the box. You don't need to do any kind of integrations or any token-based exchange between two apps to make sure this is secure. You are running in the same app. So that was the last thing I wanted to show before the break. So after the break, I will share some things that we have released in .vvm 2.5 last week, and I will show you the roadmap for .vvm 3.0, and you will see the features that you can look forward to. Okay, so I will be back in about 5 minutes or something like that. And we are back. Thank you for staying with us. In this blog, I will share what's new in DotVVM 2.5, which was released a couple of days ago. And I will also talk and explain what we plan for DotVVM 3.0. And I will tell you the release date, or the probable release date. Okay, so in DotVVM 2.5, we have done a lot of improvements and fixes. If you are interested in a complete list of features, you can go to our GitHub page, github.com/riganti/.vvm. And there is the releases section, so you can see the release notes. The most important improvements are these three features. First is explicit assembly loading, which you will find very useful, especially in web forms modernization scenarios, because if you install .vvm in an old web forms project, you may get some exceptions on the startup if your references to libraries are not correct, because .vvm, for some historical reasons, tries to load all the referenced assemblies and scan them for some artifacts. And that's what can cause these exceptions is, for example, if the project references some assembly, but the assembly is not found in the file system, or if it is in the file system, but it has a different version than the project was compiled against. Yeah, this can be fixed by just removing the reference, because if the file is not present there, and your application is working, it typically means that you don't need a reference. It's some unnecessary reference that may be used in the history, but right now it's not being used, otherwise the application would crash. So you can just remove this reference and the error message should go away. If the reference is needed, but the actual DLL on the disk has a different version, that you can probably fix this in the assembly bindings section in the webconfig file, or you can just fix the reference to point to the correct version. There are two ways how to fix it. It depends on other things like which NuGet packages added this reference and why, and what's the common lowest version you actually need in the project. But also you can use the explicit assembly loading, so you can tell .vvm, okay, don't touch on any assembly except of those that I will explicitly allow you. So if you do this, you can explicitly tell .vvm, okay, take care only about these 10 assemblies and don't touch anything else. In that case, the errors will go away, because nobody will try to load these messed up or inexistent references, and the project will work. So if you want to use this, if you have problems after you install .vvm in the project, you can use this feature to make your life easier. Of course, you can use it also in the new applications, provided that if you have a lot of references, then you might not want .vvm to scan all of this. So if you turn this on, you will just decrease the startup time of the application for a couple of hundreds milliseconds typically. It's not that slow, but if you have 50 references that you don't need to load on the startup, why just load them if you don't need to? Yeah, you can load them only when the users invoke the functionality that really requires these libraries. Yeah, so that's one of the features. The second feature is maybe more practical, and it's called view compilation modes. By default, if you visit a .vvm page on the first time, .vvm will read the markup, and because we don't want to parse it every time, we will just generate an assembly from that markup, and we will basically pre-compile the page. And so that's why when you first enter any .vvm page, it takes a couple of milliseconds extra than if you go to it next time. So this view compilation modes allow you to pre-compile everything on the startup of the application, or after the startup on background. So when the users first visit the page, it will already be pre-compiled because you pre-compiled it on the background. And the third very interesting feature is redirect helpers. you will want this feature if you are, for example, doing a redesign of your website, and you need to make sure that the old URL addresses will still work. So you can register redirecting handlers in the route table, and you can implement your own redirecting logic, even if you, for example, need to look up something in the database in order to do the correct redirect, you will be able to do it. So I will dig in these features in more detail. So as I said, explicit assembly loading is especially helpful in older projects, and basically it prevents DotVVM from scanning all the assemblies the application is using. So for example, in the .vvm startup file, you need to enable the explicit assembly loading using this config.experimental features. It's still an experimental feature. After we are sure that it's working, we will move it as a standard framework feature. So these experimental features will just be removed from this statement. So explicit assembly loading enable, and this will tell .vvm, okay, use only the assemblies which you will find in this collection. So config markup assemblies add and name of the assembly. So you will be responsible for adding all the assembly names you will need in this collection. Otherwise, .vvm will tell you, okay, sorry, I don't know this type, I don't know this assembly, I don't know what's going on. Yeah, so you can do this. I recommend to turn this feature only if you have some problems with assembly loading. So this is what you can save you. If you don't have any problems with the references, maybe keep the default on, because then this feature won't help you much, except that it will add you quite a lot of work by finding up which references you actually need to list, so it will be able to find all the types you will actually need. The view compilation modes are very interesting because by default, as I said, all pages are precompiled on the first request to the page. So if your application has thousands of pages, but there are only 2 pages which are visited frequently, and the other pages, for example, in the admin section, they are accessed just once per week, there is a big chance that if your admin will log into the site and for after some time, the pages won't be loaded and won't be compiled. So on every page the admin will access, they will need to wait for a couple of extra milliseconds before these pages are compiled. So if you don't have plenty of admin users, this may be fine, but of course it would be nicer if all these pages could be precompiled as soon as possible. So the lazy mode, I think it's very useful for the developer inner loop scenario. So you are working as a developer on the application, you change something, you need to refresh the page. So of course you don't want all the pages to be precompiled, because you are just working with one page that you are actually working on, and the other hundreds of pages, you don't care about them at that time. Yeah. So for the development, the lazy mode is easy because it's fast. Yeah, you are precompiling only the things that you actually need. If you are using the applications in production, there are 2 other modes that you can take advantage of. First is after application start, which is basically a background compilation. So the application will start up as normally, and then there is a background thread which will start going through all the pages and precompiling them on the background. There are additional parameters. You can, for example, delay this background compilation for a couple of seconds, because if the application does any other things after the startup, like for example loading the caches or things like that, then you may have some problems with this functionality. So that's what you will be able to use. So after application start, and you can delay it so it won't mess up with other initialization tasks you may have in your application. Yeah. This is great if you have only one instance in the production, because you can just say, okay, precompile everything on the background, and you don't need to care about anything else. if you have a little bit complicated scenario, like for example deployment slots, if you have staging, deployment, and production, and you are switching the slots, then a better mode for you would be during application start, because it will precompile all the pages during the startup, so before the application starts responding to the first HTTP request. And this is great in deployment slots, because the deployment slots works the way that when you deploy the application, it will start the application on the background. The requests are still going to the previous slot, to the production slot, and your application is launched in the staging environment. And they are sending some test HTTP requests in the application. And once the application responds to the first HTTP request, the load balancing infrastructure will just switch the slots, so the traffic will start going to your application. And when the application is ready, the infrastructure will know, because the application will start responding to the test HTTP requests the infrastructure is sending there. So even if this can make the application startup really long, for example 2 or 3 minutes, based on the number of pages you have in your application, it's not a problem, because you will deploy it in a slot. It will start on the background, precompile all the views, and after everything is ready, after everything is precompiled, then it will respond to the first HTTP request. So only after that the infrastructure will just switch these apps. So do not use during application start if you are not using deployment slots. But if you have deployment slots, during application start is a great mode for this scenario, because you will be able to have the very fast updates without an outage. Yeah? And the application will get enough time to precompile everything. So once you do the switch, the pages will be very fast, because they will be already precompiled. Okay, so let's look at a demo. And so I have an application which is called Northwind Store. You can find it on GitHub. If you enter .vvm and Northwind in the search engine, you will find it. It's a sample Northwind database, and the application is written over this database. So let's run it. I have the default mode specified here, so I'm now in the .vvm startup file. And you can see that the mode is set to lazy, which is the default mode. So the page will be compiled only when it's accessed the first time. If I never access the page, then it won't get precompiled at all. Okay, so let's wait a couple of seconds until this loads. There is Entity Framework initializing. Okay, so now I am on my login page, and you can see this in this top right corner. There is a thing which is called Mini Profiler, and it tells me how long all HTTP requests were. So when I refresh the page, you can see it takes about 19 milliseconds loading something from the SQLite database and rendering some things. So that's it. And if you click on it, you can see more details, and you can see how long all the operations took. This is the server side. So we have all the stages. When view was initialized, the view model was created, init, load, pre-render, serialization, rendering, HTML. Yeah, so you can see the most of the time is spent in the pre-render, which is basically loading data from SQLite. Yeah, so that's where we spend most of the time. So let's go to a page which is called products, and I haven't since the application was launched, I haven't accessed this page. So this will be the first time I will access the products page. So let's do it. And we can see that it took about 700 milliseconds. That's quite a lot. When I was testing this without the screen recording, it was a little bit faster. It took about 400 milliseconds, but I think that something is slowing my machine down because I'm grabbing the image from the screen. So that's probably the reason why it's slower than usual, but still you can see there is 400 milliseconds spent in the view initialized section. So that's the view compilation. Yeah, it needs to parse the markup, generate a lot of C# code that will represent the markup, and then use Roslyn and compile an assembly that will be stored in memory, and then the actual request gets executed. So you can see the pre-render takes 200 milliseconds because I'm loading quite a lot of data from SQLite. So that's why. Yeah, but this is just the database traffic. And also the database request 200 milliseconds for loading data from a product table. It seems like it's quite a lot, but that's also the problem of the first page load, because there is a compilation of entity framework queries. Yeah, because I'm using this query using entity framework the first time, and entity framework core needs to compile the query. So once I load the page for the second time, you will see that view initialized will be very fast because it will be already compiled. And also the pre-render should be much faster because entity framework will already have the query compiled and it will load the query plan from the cache. Yeah, so let's do it. So let's reload this page. So now it was 700 milliseconds, and now the second load is just 30 milliseconds. And you can see the view initialized, it's not 400 milliseconds, it's just 2 milliseconds, or 3 to be precise. And the pre-render is also more than 10 times faster because entity framework has some things in the cache. So you can see that the first request problem is not only a problem of .vvm, it's also a problem of entity framework, which also needs to cache the calculated query plans and computed SQL from the link queries. Yeah, so that's what slows the things down. Yeah, but you can see that now it takes about 30 milliseconds. Now it's 20, now it's 21. Yeah, so it's much faster the second and third and any other time than the first time. Okay, so what we can do with that, for the developer perspective, it's okay because you will refresh the page and then play with, but you don't need to precompile all the other pages. If you want to deploy this on the server, I recommend to use after application start. And this after application start will compile the things on the background. So when I recompile the application, and I will go to other page, so we won't touch the products page when the application starts, because when I recompile the app, it needs to be restarted. Okay, so now the application is ready. You can see that the initial startup took up about 5 milliseconds, 5 seconds, because that's all the libraries are loading, entity framework core is initializing. There is a lot of initialization work that needs to be done. There's also dependency injection, container and services. Yeah, so that's all those things are slowing the application down a little bit. But if I now go to products, everything should be already compiled on the background, because basically because there's plenty of time for the background compilation, and it starts immediately after the startup. So when I go here to the products page, you can still see it takes 400 milliseconds or 350, but that's the entity framework problem. It's not .vvm problem, because .vvm, the view initialized, is just 4 milliseconds. So it was already compiled, but still I have executed a query for the first time. So that's also almost 200 milliseconds. And again, it's slower. For example, there is the output rendered, which I don't understand why it's so big, but probably it has something to do with the grabbing of the screen, so something is slowing my machine down. Yeah, but still you can see this really helped, because the first page load is more than half faster. Yeah, it was, and now it's 350 milliseconds, and it was 750 on the first occurrence. Yeah, so it's more than half of the speed. Okay, and then when I try it again, it's 40 milliseconds, 20, yeah, 26, so about 30 milliseconds, I would say. Yeah, so you can see that even the first request, not as fast as the second and third, but still significantly faster than the other. yeah, than the original mode, the lazy mode. And if you are using deployment slots, you can use during application start. Do not use it in your developer scenarios because it would delay the startup and it would take very long time for the application to start, especially if you have a lot of pages in there. I don't have so many pages in there, so it should take a couple of seconds, a couple of extra seconds, but still be very careful. Use it only in production. If you are running on which environment you are running, you can get this information from ifconfig, the debug, for example. If debug is true, you are running locally. If debug is false, you are in production. So you can change the settings based on this parameter, for example. That's one way of how you can do it. Okay, another thing, if you want to delay the compilation so it doesn't tamper with other initialization tasks you might have in the application, there is the background compilation delay parameter, so you can turn it on. If you have a machine with a smaller number of CPU cores, you can also disable parallel compilation. By default, it tries to utilize all the CPU cores you have, so the compilation is done as fast as possible. But if you have, for example, only 2-core virtual machine, I recommend to use just a compilation on a single thread, because otherwise you would exhaust the CPU resources of the server for a couple of seconds. So maybe you don't want to do this. So be careful. I recommend that you test this profoundly to see if there are any problems with the functionality. Yeah, and what's the correct settings. It depends a lot about on quite a lot of factors. Okay, so let's use this. And the next feature, I don't have demo for it, I have just slides, is called add URL redirection. And for example, you can basically register another rules in the routes table and specify your own strategies for redirect. So for example, I want to redirect from an old URL, which is just article / and ID of the article, to content / article / the result. So you can say, please redirect this route to this route. And you can use expressions here, so you can even do some transformations to the ID. Of course, this is a thing that you can use URL rewriting tools for, some classic URL rewrite tools for that, but they work for just simple scenarios, and most of the URL rewriting tools I have seen are using regular expressions. So if it can be done using regular expressions, you can do this. But if the transformation is complicated, for example, if you don't want ID of the article, but you have some, for example, a slug of the article, which is some value calculated from the title, you will probably need to look in the database to search for the article slug. Yeah, and that's not possible to do using just regular expressions. So this gives you a lot of flexibility in implementing custom redirect strategies. There's another scenario. For example, if I want to create a calendar page and I want to have the year and month in the URL, so for example, calendar /2020/11 for this month, but also if you want to create a new URL where you don't need to specify the current month, the month and year, and if you don't specify it, you want to have current year and current month as a default, it's not a good idea to put it in the route parameters, because the route configuration is initialized when the application starts, and when the application starts on 30th November and spans into the December and is still running, the route parameters will be outdated. Yeah, so you need to use the current date time once the route is hit, not when the route is configured, because it could be weeks ago, yeah, or days ago. Yeah, so you can use this route redirection. You can say if the user just enters calendar, we will be redirecting to the calendar route, which is this one with capital C. And there's a parameters provider, which is a function, and you can supply your own values for the parameters. So I'm saying year and month are getting from datetime.now. Yeah, so this will redirect to calendar /current year /current month. Yeah, so this is quite flexible, and you can also put any code, any logic here So it's more clever than just normal regular expression-based redirection mechanisms you can find also as a ASP.NET Core middleware, or on the HTTP server there are a lot of solutions for URL rewriting or redirection, but this is more flexible if your transforms are more complicated. And I would like to also show a short demo to one of my favorite features. It's not from DotVVM 2.5, it's actually older, it's from DotVVM 2.4, but I think that a lot of users still are not aware of this feature. So let's look at the demo. What server-side viewModel cache does. It's the main objective of this feature is to decrease the traffic that is needed when the user clicks on something in the page. Yeah? If you want to invoke a command in the viewModel, basically we need to take the viewModel and send it to the server. So all the data are on the server where the command is actually executed. Yeah, and of course, if your viewModel is large, if it has tens or maybe small hundreds of kilobytes, then you will be posting quite a lot of data. Still, we have the tools like HTTP compression, which is turned everywhere on by default, I guess. So it won't be so big, but still, it's if we can get it smaller, why not? So the server-side viewModel cache can help with this, because basically it's keeping the viewModels on the server in a memory cache, or it's extensible, so you can supply any other cache you want, and the client doesn't need to send the entire viewModel. It can send to the server only the properties that have been changed. Yeah, and in many cases, you won't be changing the viewModel at all. You will see that in the demo. You just need to invoke a command, but you haven't changed the viewModel. So basically now we will be sending just almost empty payload. There are still some metadata, but the payload will still be empty. Of course, every cache can be unreliable. If there is if the server is short on memory, it may be a situation that the cache will have to wipe out some items. And if that happens, it's not a problem, because .vvm server-side part will tell the page, okay, sorry, I don't have this item in the cache anymore. Can you please repeat the request and send everything? And .vvm will do it as on the second request. So without the user actually noticing. The only problem is that it will be slower than usual, but still it will work. So there will be 2 requests, and the .vvm will basically repeat the request with the full viewModel, and the server will be able to actually process the request. Yeah, so this is nice. And also the cache items, the viewModels, are deduplicated by their hash of their content. So if there is million users who are using the same viewModel, the same the same content in the viewModel, it won't be stored million times in the cache. It will be stored there only once, which is great for almost static pages or pages that don't change so frequently, because it will save a lot of memory. So let's see how the process works without the cache. So until .vvm 2.4, basically if you entered a .vvm page using a standard HTTP GET request, the server will respond with HTML, and there will be a viewModel which is baked in the HTML. Yeah, so you are getting one response with both the page and its viewModel. So that's the standard behavior. And if the user clicks on some calculate button in the page, then the entire viewModel is serialized and sent to the server. And you can see that this number is different than it was before. Yeah, so that's it. And the server will be able also to change the viewModel, and it will send the rest of the page. Basically, it will send only the diff of the viewModel, because the client still has the viewModel. So from the server to the client, it's quite efficient, because the server sends only what's changed. But the way from the client to the server is the problematic way, because we need to send the entire viewModel, because the server doesn't have the viewModel in any kind of cache. Yeah, so that's the standard behavior. And if you turn on the cache and make a HTTP GET request, the server responds as normally, but it will keep the view model in the cache using some ID. This is the hash of the view model content. So if there are a million requests that produce the same view model, it will be stored in the cache only once. And it's sent to the client, including the ID of the view model in the cache. And this allows the client to send only difference of the view model. So if I was changing just one of the values in the view model, then the client will send ID of the view model, which is ABCD, and the property that has been changed. The rest of the view model, which is still the same, is not transferred. So this will save quite a lot of data, because typically you don't change the entire view model, you change only a tiny part of that. And on the server will look in the cache, it will find this view model, then it will apply the diff, so it will set the num1 to 15 and invoke the calculate method. So it produces another view model, and it needs also to go to the cache. It has different content because num1 is now 40. So you have a second item in the cache and it has different hash. So you can see this new cache ID goes to the client. So that's how it works in the principle. Now let's look at the demo. And I'm using the same app for the demo. But I need to compile a few things. I need to change a couple of things. First, I will disable mini profiler because it's doing some requests I don't want to. And now I turn on my special diagnostic console and I can run the application once again. And I can go to the products page, and what this console at the bottom does is that it measures how many bytes I have sent to the server and how many bytes I received from the server. So, for example, I have loaded this page. So I got HTML, including the view model, and I want to go to the page 2. So it means that I haven't changed the view model on the client at all. I haven't touched anything that is in the view model. I just displayed it to the user, and the user said, okay, nothing of this really interests me. I need to go to the page 2. So no changes in the view model. And if you click on it, you can see that the request size was about 14 kilobytes, because basically .vvm in all cases, it took the entire view model and sent it to the server. In reality, there is HTTP compression, so the real numbers will be something like 30% of that. So it's not 14 kilobytes, it's just 5, but still it's quite a lot. And these are basically wasted bytes because they are not used on the server for any good purpose. They are just thrown away. New page from the database is being loaded, and that's what you get in the new view model. That's those 20 kilobytes. If I go back to page 1, you can see that the request is smaller because the page 2 was shorter, so the view model was smaller. And page 1 is longer, so now the response is longer. But the response is not a problem because you need to get all those records. So there's not many ways how to decrease the size of the response. But still, the request size is what bothers me. And that's what the server-side view model cache can help with, because it just sends only the parts of the view model which have changed. And I'm just switching the pages. I'm not changing anything in the view model, basically. So let's turn this feature on. And you can enable it on a per route basis. So I'm enabling it for all routes in the application. If you don't believe this functionality, you can enable it just for one specific route to try it out. Or if you don't have significant problems or on other routes, you can just turn it on the one route which is causing problems. So let's reload the page, and let's remember the numbers. So the first request was about 15 kilobytes. The second is about 9 kilobytes. So now I'm refreshing the page with the new settings. I had to recompile the application because the configuration is done in C#. Now I have the exact same page, but with the server-side cache. So when I click on page 2, you can see now I have only 2.7 kilobytes. Yeah, these are some shared metadata which needs to be sent with every command to the server. So there is some constant value which will always be there, but it's not that big. It's a very big difference between 15 kilobytes and less than 3 kilobytes. So this is great. When I go back to page 1, yeah, you can see there is also something like 2 kilobytes, and the response is bigger because the first page has more results, but still this is smaller. And there are also some things that we could make more efficient, so even these responses are a little bit smaller than they were in the previous version. Yeah, so this is quite interesting, and I think that the server-side cache can be very helpful. And there is another thing. There is a special page which is called server-side cache diagnostics, and if you want to get this page, you need to install one extra NuGet package, and it's called .vvm.diagnostics.server-side cache. Yeah, so this is what you need to install in your app, and then you will get this URL _diagnostics/cache, and there is a list of all routes, and you can see some statistics of how much the server-side cache actually saved for you. Yeah, so you can see there is this route, this admin product list, and sorry, I need to look up this. So cached view model instances, we have 3, because first instance is when the page is loaded, then when I go to the second page, and then when I go to the first page. It looks like the view model is a little bit different when I return to the first page than if I load it on the first time. But we have 3 instances of the view model in the cache. If I refresh this page multiple times and go here, you can see that the number of instances in the cache hasn't increased because the view models on the page load were the same. So the same ID, the same cache item was reused. Yeah, that's amazing thing, because if the page gets million users, the memory consumption required by this feature, because you are caching something in the server, is just 70 kilobytes. Yeah. So that's what it costs on the server resources. Of course, nobody's using this application. I have only one user and I'm using only one page. So in reality, it won't be such low values, but still it's quite nice that it can help. And there is the number of how many times average the view models were used. So the higher is better, because if you have just small number of view models and you are using them repeatedly, that's great, because you are saving the server memory. There is some efficiency score, which is a metrics we calculate based on other numbers. And here you can see what you actually saved and what would be the payload transferred by the request if the cache was disabled. Yeah, so this is what you actually transferred, and this is what you would transfer if you wouldn't have the cache. Yeah, so this is how much data you saved on the way from the client to the server. And if your cache is small, if your server is low on memory, then this red section would have some non-zero numbers, because it means that the request was trying to use the cache, but the item was not in the cache. Yeah, so you have a cache miss. So this is how many times it happened, and how many extra bytes were transferred, how many extra requests there were, because if there is a cache miss, the application is doing 2 requests, which doesn't transfer so much extra data, but it takes longer time because now you are doing 2 requests and there is the latency and all those things that involved by doing 2 requests. So that's a problem. But if you have enough memory, this should be just zeros in this section. Yeah. There is a legend, so you can read all this information about every column and how to interpret the data. Be careful on pages which are used very frequently. If the page has millions of users, you may not want to turn this feature on, because only if you are 100% sure that they will be sharing the view models. Otherwise, there will be a huge load on the server memory. So make sure that you have enough memory. Yeah. Also, if the reuse of the view model is small, if the view model reuse is close to 1, it probably means that you have some unique value in the view model which prevents to share these view models. Yeah. So if you, for example, store a current date in the view model, that means that you have effectively turned off the view model reuse. So make sure that if you turn this feature on some pages, that the view model reuse is not just 1, but the higher the better. Okay, so this is server-side view model cache. The only thing you need to do to try this feature is just to say config experimental feature server-side view model cache enable for all routes, and that's it. And I recommend also to install the .vvm diagnostics server-side cache package, so you would see the dashboard and you can see how much data you saved to your users. Okay, so that was a feature from .vvm 2.4. And now I would like to share a few words about what we are planning with .vvm in the future. So we have 3 main objectives for our users that we want to help with. The first is extensibility and better interoperation with JavaScript libraries, with JavaScript world, because .vvm is not an isolated island on the web. We are running in the browser, and browser offers a lot of features, and most of them are accessible only from JavaScript. So we want .vvm to stay away from that and don't go, not stay away, but don't go in your way if you want to do anything with JavaScript. So we want that this would be as seamless as possible. So until now, it was quite difficult to call, for example, JavaScript functions from .vvm controls. For example, if you change the value in some drop-down list, you would like to call a JavaScript function, and it wasn't easy to do in .vvm. It is possible, but it's not straightforward. So we would like to make this as straightforward as possible. There is also the opposite problem. If you have some JavaScript functionality where you want to, for example, call a command in the view model, it's also not very easy to use. Until now, most of the users were creating hidden buttons and clicking on them from JavaScript, because that was the easy way how to call a command in the view model from JavaScript, but it's not a nice way to do things, and also there wasn't a way to make sure that the request was actually successful, because you could click the button but you couldn't get the result of this operation. So that's what we want to address. We want to have a nice API that would allow you to interact from JavaScript to .vvm and from .vvm to JavaScript. So both two-way communication, something like that. Second problem we have is that .vvm supports creating user controls using the markup. So it's a piece of markup that you can embed in any page. Or there are other ways to write, it's called code-only controls, which can be more advanced. They could generate things dynamically, and it's quite powerful, but it's not easy to use. It's too complicated. You have to understand a lot of things, how .vvm works, how it generates data bindings, and the binding system is very powerful, but also quite complicated because it's strongly typed, which is great for the developers because you want to make silly typos without being noticed. But on the other hand, it's a problem because it makes things complicated. Yeah, you cannot just say eval and compose your own binding expression. It's not easy like that. So that's what we would like to address, and we want to deliver better API for building controls. We already have some pull requests on GitHub, but they need some other work, but that's what we are looking into. And we also want to bring some more high-level concepts, basically provide something like out-of-the-box solutions for common tasks you are working on in your application. So as an example, for example, many pages are using model dialogues. And we have model dialog control in some of our control packages we offer. But that's not the only thing you need. You will need a view model for the model dialogues. And a lot of users were writing some model dialog base view model class because most of the dialogues had some show and hide methods. Most of the dialogues could reset to some initial state and do such things. And we would like to have interfaces and base classes for these purposes. Maybe not directly in the framework, but in some extra package. Or there are a lot of things like multi-step wizards or some master detail views, and that's possible to do with .vvm, but you are doing a lot of things. You have to build your own infrastructure on that, and I would like to make these things a little bit easier, maybe with some clever base classes, with some clever interfaces that you would be able to extend and implement your own way, but you would have some shared common principles you can build on. So that's one of the ideas we have for .vvm, and maybe a similar. If you imagine, for example, ASP.NET Core Identity, it's a universal solution for user management. So if you want to create and edit and delete users, there is API for that. There is a lot of storage providers, so you can choose if you want to store it in SQL database using Entity Framework, or in Azure Table Storage, or in MongoDB, or anywhere else. Yeah, but the interfaces are still the same, and that's something we would like to provide, not for user identity because we already have ASP.NET Core Identity, but for other things, and typically because .vvm is a UI framework, so for the UI, common UI patterns and practices. So something like that. And of course, if it looks interesting to you, we would be very happy for feedback. If there's something from this area you are missing in .vvm, please share with us. We will be very happy to talk about this, because this idea is still in very early stage, and we still don't know exactly how it should look like. That's just one of the directions we may be going in the future. So the .vvm team is now working on .vvm 3.0, and we have done quite a lot of work which is already prepared. We have also released a preview of .vvm 3.0 where you can try these things. The biggest improvement was a total rewrite of the JavaScript part of .vvm, because .vvm is both client and server-side framework. There are two pieces, and we have basically redone the JavaScript part. We are using modern TypeScript versions with modules and all those new features that appeared in JavaScript world recently. And we have also done a refactoring in the postback dispatch pipeline, which is if you invoke a command from the view, or if you are calling static commands, or you are doing navigation in SPAs, that's all included in the postback pipeline. So we have fixed some issues, some race conditions, and we have refactored this so it's more extensible and more understandable to external readers. We have also improved some events which were not getting all the parameters that would make sense, so we have cleaned this up. There are some features that are in progress, and one of them is a thing which has internal name called JS modules, but that's not the final name because it means something else in JavaScript. So we are not decided yet on the final name, but it will allow you to interact with JavaScript libraries and components easily from .vvm, and vice versa. These JavaScript functions will be able to interact with .vvm view model and call .vvm commands. Yeah, so basically you will be able to call JavaScript functions from .vvm markup. You will be able and .vvm components. That's the most important thing. And you will be able to do callbacks from JavaScript to .vvm for example, yeah, so you will be able to invoke some things on the view model, and you will be also able to patch the view model with your own modifications. Until now, you could do this, but it was quite dangerous because the view model is actually a hierarchy of knockout observable. DotVVM is using knockout.js library under the cover, and basically, so there was this creepy syntax like .vvm view models root, view model items, and all those braces, because items is actually knockout observable, so you need to evaluate it. Then it's an array, so you need to get to the third element, and the element itself is observable, so also you need to unwrap it, and then there is some property, and you need to, it's also observable. So this is the reason for all those parentheses, and it's not very nice. So we would like to provide a nice and safe way for working with the view model. So you will be able to import a JavaScript module in your page. So we are not decided on the syntax yet, but it will be something like this: JS module and path to the module. And you will be able to invoke functions in that module using the command syntax. So you will be able to use static command and _JS invoke and call function, for example, add marker, and pass some values from the view model to the function. So the function will not have to deal with observables. It will just get the raw numbers, the latitude and the longitude. And the module is a JavaScript file which can export the init function. It will be called immediately when the page is loaded after .vvm initialize, and then it can export commands for the invoke function. So for example, here I'm exporting the add marker function with 2 parameters, latitude, longitude, and I can do my things. And I can call it easily from .vvm. So if you want to use button with all things like the enabled binding and things like that, you can, and you can call JavaScript methods for that from that. And also, if you need to do way back, for example, if the user adds the marker, you will want to save the selection on the server, for example. So you can use this invisible control, which is called named command in the page. And basically you say, this is the command I call save. Yeah, so name of the command is save, and it will do this. And from the JavaScript, you can then say context.name command save invoke. There will be a way to pass parameters to that. So you will be able also to pass parameters to commands, and it will return a promise. So you can use async await in a JavaScript. And if it fails, you can just try catch and catch for the error and do the error handling. And because it returns promise, there is the await. So after the request is finished, the next line will continue. So it's pretty convenient, and I would like to emphasize that DotVVM started in 2014, which is 6 years ago. We are still here, and we haven't had many breaking changes in the syntax. But and at that time, we wanted to avoid JavaScript completely because the tooling of JavaScript in 2014, it wasn't that great. Yeah? There wasn't even Visual Studio Code and those modern tools. Also the TypeScript, it existed, but it didn't had so many features like today. But during these 6 years, the JavaScript world has changed completely, and JavaScript is now pretty convenient. It has good tooling. There is, with TypeScript, you have amazing IntelliSense, amazing experience, and it's very flexible. And when we were doing the rewrite of the JavaScript part of .vvm, I was really amazed how convenient for work this is. So I don't think we should avoid JavaScript. I don't think we should fight JavaScript. I think that for .vvm the best thing is just to dive into the JavaScript world. And if there is some task where .vvm is the most efficient way to do it, use .vvm for it. And if there is something that's easier to do in JavaScript, do it in JavaScript, and let those two things communicate easily and conveniently with each other. I think this is the greatest approach, and that's how the web works. You can use different technologies, you can combine different approaches, just use the easiest thing for the particular tasks, and you will be you will be good. So that's our motivation. Together with this, we plan to change the internal representation of the view model. Right now, as I mentioned, the view model in .vvm on the client side is wrapped as a hierarchy of knockout observables, and it means that you need to use this ugly syntax to do anything with the view model. Most of the time you don't have to, because you are manipulating with the view model in C#, but if you are writing your custom JavaScript code and you want to interact with the view model, you need to use this. And we really don't like it. And also it's unsafe, because you can, if you set something incorrectly, you can break things up. .vvm won't be able to serialize it correctly. The data won't be transferred to the server as they should be. So you can create a lot of problems which are difficult to debug. So we want to represent the view model as a plain JavaScript object. We will build some knockout observable hierarchy on that, but it will be hidden from you, and you will be able to patch this view model with your own modifications. There you won't get probably a direct access to change anything on the view model, but there will be API which you can use to mutate the view model, because right now we plan it to be immutable. This should also give us a better client-side performance, because right now a lot of time is spent by deserializing and serializing the model and wrapping it in the knockout observables, and we won't need to do this anymore, because we are just take the object and use it as the immutable view model state. And we also want to introduce type checking. So if you try to patch the view model with some modifications, and for example, you will try to set string to a number property, we will try to do automatic conversion. And if it fails, you will get a JavaScript error. So you will know that you are doing something which is not correct. Yeah, right now it wasn't strongly typed at all. Nobody was checking the types, and you could lose data, you could get some errors in the serialization. So it's not a great thing how it was now. It wasn't very safe. If you didn't write JavaScript, there's no problems, because we are generating all the interactions with the view model correctly, or I hope that they are correct. But if you wanted to interact with the view model from JavaScript, it wasn't really easy. So we want to change this. We have recently decided that we will try to release .vvm every 3 months. If you are using .vvm for a long time, you know that many times in the past we were promising some feature to be, some release to be released in September, then it was November, because we were delaying releases to squeeze more features in. We have recently decided that this is not a good strategy, so we will try to stick to release dates, to release cycle about every 3 months. And if we see that some features cannot make to the release, never mind, we will just do the release and the features will be delayed to the next release. So we plan to release more regularly, and you can track the progress on GitHub. If you go to this URL, github.com/riganti/.vvm, there is the project section, and we have a task board where you can see what we are working on, what we are considering, what's in the design phase, what is being tested, and what's already done. So you can track the progress. You can track the progress there. And there are some features which we want to do and we have started working on, but we are probably they won't make into 3.0, so hopefully 3.1 or 4.0, but we want to have the 3 months release cycle. So one of the things is grid view dataset extensibility. If you are using the grid view control, we have a nice class which is called grid view dataset, which helps you to do the sorting and paging and filtering and these things. However, if you want to use different paging strategy than the page numbers, the most common solution in the relational world, it's quite difficult, because the pager is working with the page index and page size parameters. And there is no way how you can do it differently. You can do it on your own, but you cannot take advantage of all the things that grid view dataset gives to you. So you need to have your own collection, and you have to keep track of the paging on your own. We have introduced in a pull request that is not merged to the current branch, but still it's work in progress. We have created a generic grid view dataset class where you have type parameters that represent your sorting, paging, and filtering criteria. So if you are paging using numeric paging, you will have page index, page size there. If you want to use, for example, token-based paging, or if you have only one-way paging, yeah, that you are, for example, loading data from some API and it cannot go back, it can just give me next page of the results. Yeah? So these load more buttons or something like that. We will make it possible using this paging parameter. So you can just inherit from this class and substitute the specific sorting, paging, and filtering strategies to this generic grid view dataset, and you will get this functionality out of the box. So it will be more extensible than it's right now, because if you don't fit in our approach of grid view dataset, then you need to use your own collection and you need to do everything on your own. So that's what we want to change. Another very interesting feature we are planning for quite a long time, unfortunately, there have been a lot of changes we need to do in our command line tooling to make this feature work reliably, is what we call Selenium generator. And basically we want to have a way how to generate UI tests, but the biggest issue of UI tests is that they can break very easily. If you do any change in the user interface, you move some button to other part of the screen, these tests will probably not find the button and the tests will fail. But until you run these tests, you don't know which tests are broken. And the UI tests are slow because they need to physically run the browser and interact with the contents in the page. So, for example, in .vvm project, we are using the Selenium tests to test all the features of the framework, and these are quite simple tests, but still they are running for 30 minutes or something like that. So if you do a change, you don't want to wait 30 minutes until you know that you haven't break anything. And one of the reasons why the UI tests are breaking is that something that should be on some place is not there anymore. And the Selenium generator can scan the .HTML files, and for every control it discovers, it can generate something like a stub or something like that. And basically from every page we will generate a C# class which contains references to everything that is on the page. And if you move something, this generated class will change, so you will get compile error in your UI test. So you will immediately know which tests are affected by some change in the UI. And in the UI test, it will be very easy to write these tests because, for example, you will have something like page.email text box.fill, and you can fill the value. Then you will have a reference for the login button. You can click on it. You can make sure that some alert contains some error message. Yeah, so that's what you can expect of this feature. And these definitions of email text box, password text box, login button, and so on, these will be generated for you, so you don't need to write them. And if you change your UI, the generated code will change too, and that's where your tests break, because if you remove the password field, there will be no password text box property in that generated class. So you will immediately know that this test has been broken because it won't even compile. So that's what we are, and I am really looking forward to this feature, because until now, writing UI tests was quite complicated, but I think that with this tool, it can be really fun, it can be very easy, and if we can just create a test project for you and make you everything, make everything go out of the way, so you can just write these 4 lines and have your page covered with a UI test, I think this is very powerful. Yeah. And even if you write hundreds of these tests, they won't be a burden, because if there is some change in the UI that means that some tests need to be rewritten or edited, you will know it because they won't compile. So that's what I'm really looking forward. I think this is a nice feature, and I hope that we will be able to squeeze it in the release after .vvm 3.0. So also I mentioned already we want to have a way to write controls more easily. So we have a pull request that allows you to, for example, generate controls by using function. It's a little bit like a React style of defining controls, but we think that it's quite powerful. So that's what I'm also looking forward to. Right now in our view models, it's quite complicated to work with some types, especially if the types are immutable, if they have some custom constructors and things like that. Also, the record types in C#9, they are a little problematic in .vvm view models in some cases, so that's what we would like to address. If you need this earlier than after 3.0, please let us know. If there is more users that are very interested in this feature, we can try to squeeze it in 3.0. Of course, if you want to help us with development of this feature, just also let us know. We will be happy to enhance the team. .vvm is open source project, so we are always open for new contributors and new people. And we also would like to offer more features in the data binding expressions. Right now you can have logical expressions and things like that in data bindings, but I would like to be able to translate more .NET functions. So for example, the link support, because you would be able to load some data from the server and then, for example, do client-side searching or client-side sorting. Yeah, so filtering and things like that. So it would be pretty nice. So that's also what we are looking into. So that's everything from this session and from this local event. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. And also, we will be happy to talk to you on our Gitter chat. If you search for .vvm and Gitter in Google, you will find it pretty easily. So I will be very happy to talk with anyone who is interested in .vvm. So please share your questions, share your thoughts anywhere, and we will be happy to talk. And no matter if you want to build new web applications using the model view model approach, or if you want to try .vvm for modernizing of legacy web forms applications, we will be happy to help. So if you run into any issues, any problems, just reach out to us and we will be happy to help. So thank you. I hope that you enjoyed this session. I hope that you enjoyed .NET Conf because it's a great event. And we got a lot of announcements right there. And so I wish you good luck with using .NET 5. And if you haven't tried .vvm, just go to dotvvm.com/install, install the Visual Studio extension, and let us know. We will be very happy for any feedback. Thank you and take care. And there are some questions in the chat. I see that my colleague Michal, thank you, has answered quite a lot of them. So that's great. Thank you, Michal. I think I owe you a beer. And I will post a link to our Gitter chat in the discussion, so we can continue the discussion there, because I think that when we end this stream, that YouTube will lock this discussion. Okay, so the URL is now in the chat. And thank you for watching, and I will be happy to talk with anyone. Okay, thank you.